Project 64-1, designated Foxtrot by NATO, represented a new step in the development of Soviet diesel-electric submarines after World War II. It was based on the preceding Whiskey class, but featured larger battery capacity and was much quieter, making it ideal for stealth operations during the Cold War. Engineers solved the challenge of limited range with a double-hull design. This improved buoyancy control and compartment layout, enabling the submarine to operate more effectively while submerged and withstand significant pressure. From 1957 to 1983, over 60 of these submarines were built, forming the backbone of the Soviet fleet for patrols and coastal defense. This submarine had a surface displacement of 2,157 tons and a submerged displacement of 2,738 tons. Its length was nearly 300 feet, with a beam of 25 feet and a draft of about 20 feet. Propulsion was provided by 3 Columna 2D42M diesel engines, generating a total of 6,000 horsepower. The boat had a surface speed of 16.7 knots. While submerged, it used 3 electric motors, 2 main motors producing 2,700 horsepower each, and 1 economical motor. These allowed it to reach a submerged speed of 15.9 knots. The main priority for these systems was reliability, not just raw power. The enlarged batteries allowed the boat to remain submerged for 3 to 5 days at low speeds. This was critical for stealth, as using a snorkel to run the diesels presented a major risk of detection by enemy radar. Its diving depth ranged from 820 to 918 feet. For extended missions, it carried a crew of 78. Special materials and hull shape minimized noise and vibration, which had been the main problem with earlier models. The double-hull design evenly distributed water pressure and increased the chances of surviving a depth charge attack or a collision. Thanks to their quiet and stable operation, these submarines were perfectly suited for both shallow water ambushes and open ocean interceptions. However, their speed and range still fell short when compared to the newer nuclear submarines. One of these submarines, designated B-43-5, was laid down on March 24, 1970, at a shipyard in Leningrad. It was launched on May 29th of that same year, and by November 6th, it had officially joined the Soviet Black Sea Fleet. The boat was built according to standard Foxtrot-class blueprints, featuring a diesel-electric power plant for coastal patrols and attacks. Its submerged displacement was 2,728 tons. The initial sea trials confirmed all of its stated specifications. The surface range at economical speed reached 16,000 nautical miles. While submerged, due to battery limitations, the boat could operate for 3 to 5 days at a submerged speed of 3 knots. Testing proved the reliability of the engines, the ability to reach a diving depth of 820 feet, and the successful integration of the weapons systems. The submarine fully met all design requirements for service in the Black Sea. During its early years of service, B-43-5 regularly patrolled as part of the Black Sea Fleet. The crew practiced launching torpedoes, conducted simulated attacks on surface ships, and carried out coastal reconnaissance missions. According to declassified documents, no serious mechanical failures or accidents occurred on board during this time. This confirmed the reputation of the Foxtrot-class as highly reliable diesel submarines during the Soviet naval buildup of the Cold War. The division of the former Soviet Black Sea Fleet between Russia and Ukraine was finalized by an agreement signed on May 28, 1997, in Kyiv by Prime Ministers Viktor Chernomyrdin and Pavlo Lazarenko. Under this document, Russia received about 82% of the combat and auxiliary ships, while Ukraine got roughly 18%. Among them were a few surface vessels and a single Project 641 Foxtrot-class submarine, B-435. The transfer of B-435 served as a sort of compensation to Ukraine for giving up the rest of the fleet and basing rights, since Russia assumed primary control by stationing its forces in Sevastopol. The transfer of the submarine took place at the naval base in Sevastopol in late 1997. Prior to that, the boat had been sitting in reserve for quite a while, as its batteries had failed in 1995. The vessel became inoperable, and the Russian military didn't bother repairing it because it was outdated. When the vessel passed to the Ukrainian Navy, it was renamed Zaporizhzhia and given the pennant number U-01. This was Ukraine's only submarine asset, and it immediately highlighted the young Navy's financial struggles. They received the hardware, but there was no money for urgent upgrades. Initial inspections after the handover showed that the pressure hull remained solid, even though many parts had been stripped away. However, critically important systems, like the batteries and electronics, needed complete replacement. The Ukrainian military couldn't quickly secure the funds for this due to the economic struggles following the collapse of the Soviet Union. As a result, the necessary repairs were postponed. The submarine sat tied to the pier for years, since Ukraine at the time was more focused on its surface fleet rather than restoring its single submarine. After officially joining the Ukrainian Navy in July 1997, Zaporizhzhia was immediately sent to a dry dock in Sevastopol. They had to reverse the wear and tear of long Soviet service, inspect the hull, and replace the old batteries, because without them, diving was impossible. The Ukrainian command lacked its own shipyards for such a massive overhaul of a diesel-electric submarine, so it had to rely on facilities under joint Ukrainian-Russian management. This created logistical problems and delays. The lack of money made the situation worse. Russian specialists estimated the repair costs at roughly $20 million. This amount far exceeded the Ukrainian defense budget allocated for old Soviet equipment. Repairs moved slowly right up until the early 2000s. The main focus was on the engines and auxiliary systems. But due to the breakdown of Soviet supply chains, there was a constant shortage of specific parts. The diesel engines ran unreliably, so the submarine was limited to pier-side testing instead of full sea trials. Ukrainian Ministry of Defense reports from that time noted that the submarine served as a training platform for new crews. Because of incomplete repairs and a lack of spare parts, its combat readiness remained far too low for real missions. There were no actual deployments. Instead, Zaporizhzhia served more as a symbolic confirmation of Ukraine's status as a maritime nation. Sea trials were rare and were limited to brief maneuvers in the waters of the Black Sea. This period clearly showed just how hard it is to maintain old Soviet hardware without a strong domestic industry. More than 10 years of slow repairs passed before any serious attempts were made to return the boat to active duty. After being handed over to the Ukrainian Navy on July 11, 1997, the submarine Zaporizhzhia went into dry dock for repairs and remained largely inactive for the next 15 years. This drawn-out repair process reflected the broader problems of the post-Soviet Ukrainian fleet, specifically the lack of budget funds and a reliance on Russian suppliers for spare parts and fuel. Because of this, any serious combat deployments were completely impossible. By July 2010, the vessel was being prepped for post-refit trials. Before this, during its lengthy maintenance, it was considered an inactive unit. In January 2011, Zaporizhzhia left dry dock in Sevastopol. Initial tests confirmed the onboard systems were working normally, though full sea trials were delayed for further inspections. The sea trials planned for May 2011 had to be postponed due to issues found during a preliminary inspection. Limited activity resumed when new sea trials began in July 2012. The first test run successfully wrapped up on July 18th, and on July 20th, a successful single-day dive in the Black Sea confirmed the submarine's ability to operate submerged. These brief sea runs were Zaporizhzhia's only missions until 2014. There were no records of extended patrols or combat drills. This highlighted ongoing maintenance issues, even though the submarine itself was designed for engaging surface targets and laying mines. After being transferred to the Ukrainian Navy, Zaporizhzhia underwent a lengthy modernization in Sevastopol. The refit was meant to fix years of issues and restore the diesel-electric systems. On January 21, 2013, official ceremonies featuring Ukrainian Navy leadership took place in Sevastopol, marking the submarine's long-awaited return to active service. By late June 2013, all the lengthy repairs and tests were finished, allowing the boat to return to the fleet and proving its combat readiness. Further trials proved the submarine could operate in the Black Sea, and it officially became Ukraine's only active submarine asset. The upgrades took place under the tight resource constraints of the Ukrainian Navy at leased facilities in Sevastopol. However, because of the vessel's advanced age, constant technical problems prevented it from returning to its original Soviet specifications. There is no public data on large-scale exercises in 2013, but getting the submarine back in service readied it for defensive patrols and training engagements in the region right before tensions escalated. In late February 2014, unmarked Russian troops, later identified as Russian Special Forces, began seizing key facilities in Crimea. Among these was the naval base in Sevastopol, where Zaporizhzhia was docked. These actions effectively blockaded the Ukrainian fleet. Because of broken communications with command in Kyiv following the Revolution of Dignity, the ships could not be relocated or scuttled. Ukrainian naval leadership ordered the ships to pull out, but Zaporizhzhia, which was undergoing pierside repairs at the time, remained immobilized since Russian forces already controlled all access points and the surrounding waters. On March 22, 2014, Russian Marines boarded Zaporizhzhia after surrounding it with Black Sea Fleet ships. This forced the Ukrainian crew to evacuate without armed resistance. The submarine was captured intact. This happened just days after the disputed Crimean referendum on March 16th. Russian authorities used this as an excuse to seize local facilities, framing their actions as defending historically Russian territory from imagined threats posed by the new post-Maidan Ukrainian government. Ukrainian officials condemned the seizure of the vessel as an illegal act of aggression that violated the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. Under this document, Russia had promised to respect Ukraine's borders in exchange for its nuclear disarmament. Independent observers and international experts described the takeover of the Ukrainian naval forces, including the submarine Zaporizhzhia, as bloodless. However, this happened under conditions of coercion and a violation of sovereignty, as by mid-March, Russian troops already had full control of the peninsula. Assessments of those events differed. Ukrainian sources emphasized a forced blockade starting in February, while Russian sources claimed a voluntary surrender following the referendum. Independent analysts confirmed the lack of casualties but questioned the legality of the referendum held during a military occupation. Acting Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Andriy Deshitsia, emphasized at a briefing on March 25, 2014, that the seizure of the submarine Zaporizhzhia was part of massive Russian violations during the occupation of Crimea. The Ukrainian government condemned this seizure as illegal. It violated international agreements, specifically the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, under which Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for territorial integrity guarantees. Diplomatic protests reached the United Nations, where Ukraine demanded condemnation of the annexation and the return of seized military property. However, demands to return the submarine did not yield quick results. Having lost its only active submarine, Ukraine was left without a submarine fleet. This forced the remnants of the naval forces, which relocated to ports like Odessa, to focus on surface ships, patrol boats, and asymmetric coastal defense in the following years. This situation highlighted the vulnerability of basing key forces in Sevastopol. Sharing the base under the 1997 Fleet Partition Treaty and Russian lease agreements proved impatient amid rising tensions. Russia quickly incorporated Zaporizhzhia into its Black Sea Fleet on March 22, 2014. This increased the number of their submarines in Crimea to 4 vessels. However, just a week later, Russian specialists deemed the boat obsolete and inoperable. They opted against using it actively, instead offering the Ukrainian crew positions in their own fleet. Initial reports noted no severe damage or sabotage, which preserved the hull for potential future use. After being seized during the annexation of Crimea in March 2014, the submarine received the new designation B-435 and was officially added to the Russian Black Sea Fleet, while Ukrainian national symbols were removed from its hull. Stationed primarily in Sevastopol, it was placed into long-term reserve status. The boat underwent occasional maintenance to prevent further deterioration, but without full modernization or restoration for frontline service. The obsolete Project 64-1 design, which the boat was built under back in 1971, limited its practical utility. At the same time, the fleet relied on 6 more powerful diesel-electric submarines of Project 636, Warship. These were the ones carrying out the primary submarine missions in the Black Sea. Open-source monitoring from 2014 to 2020 revealed no documented combat patrols or major exercises involving B-435. This reflected a lack of resources and a strategic pivot by the Russian Navy toward newer vessels capable of sustained submarine operations and equipped with more modern weaponry. Until 2019, Russian authorities considered scrapping the submarine due to its poor condition and high repair costs, but it remained in storage. Preservation efforts focused on hull integrity rather than combat readiness. The value of the vessel seemed largely symbolic. It was meant to demonstrate control over former Ukrainian naval infrastructure rather than provide any tactical benefit. This is also evidenced by its absence from reports on Black Sea Fleet operations during the escalation of the situation. From 2021 to 2024, against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine, this submarine did not participate in any confirmed operations. Satellite imagery and military surveillance data showed that it was permanently moored in Sevastopol. There was also consideration of temporarily moving it to Novorossiysk due to Ukrainian strikes on facilities in Crimea. Analysts criticized the Russian Navy for inefficiency, noting that the command failed to either utilize or finally decommission this old vessel, despite the need for submarines in wartime. However, basic maintenance likely kept it as a potential parts donor or reserve. Ukrainian intelligence and Western experts highlight that this idle time is a prime example of broader maintenance issues within the Black Sea Fleet, where propaganda is prioritized over actual modernization. In late August 2025, following dock repairs at the Sevastopol Marine Plant, Russian leadership announced its intention to turn the captured Ukrainian submarine Zaporizhzhia into a museum exhibit. They plan to complete this process by the end of the year. Preparations for the conversion began back in 2024. The main focus was on restoring the underwater section of the hull so the boat could become a static display rather than return to sea. This Foxtrot-class diesel-electric submarine was commissioned back in 1970 into the Soviet Navy. Today, it is considered completely obsolete. Its age and old technology make any further military use in modern conditions impossible. Russian statements frame this conversion as preserving historical heritage, likely for inclusion in Crimean maritime exhibitions. Ukrainian officials and media have called this initiative a propaganda stunt. They view it more as displaying a trophy to justify the 2014 annexation of Crimea than true heritage preservation. No exact museum location outside of Crimea has been confirmed, although Sevastopol facilities suggest it will be located alongside other historical displays. The Foxtrot-class submarine Zaporizhzhia features a single steel pressure hull measuring roughly 300 feet long, 25 feet wide, and with a draft of 20 feet. It is divided into 7 watertight compartments to improve survivability. Double hull sections at the bow and stern contain the main ballast tanks for controlling buoyancy and stability while submerged. The pressure hull is built from high-yield nickel steel up to 7/8 of an inch thick. It is designed for a maximum diving depth of 820 feet and a test depth of 984 feet. Propulsion is provided by a classic diesel-electric system. It consists of 2 Columna diesel engines. Each of them puts out 3,000 horsepower, making a total of 6,000 horsepower. They turn generators to charge the batteries and support operations on the surface. 3 electric motors, powered by silver zinc batteries, turn 3 shafts. They allow the boat to reach a surface speed of up to 16 knots and a submerged speed of 15 knots. The snorkel mast allows the crew to charge the batteries and run the diesels while semi-submerged. This provides a range of 16,000 to 20,000 nautical miles at an economical surface speed of 7 to 8 knots. During its service in the Ukrainian Navy, in 2012 and 2013, the submarine underwent a partial modernization. The worn-out batteries were replaced to restore submerged endurance. However, the main diesel and electric motors did not receive any major repairs. These upgrades solved chronic power issues that had persisted since the 1990s, but they did not fix the fundamental design flaws. For example, for long patrols, the submarine still relied on auxiliary generators. The submarine Zaporizhzhia was equipped with a bow sonar suite. It consisted of a Tamir 5 active sonar and a Phoenix passive system. This allowed it to detect surface ships and submarines at line-of-sight distances, which was perfectly typical for diesel-electric platforms of the 1960s. Standard optical periscopes were used for visual search and navigation. In addition, MRP series electronic intelligence antennas were mounted in the conning tower to intercept radar signals. All of this helped the crew spot threats from the air and on the water in time. During the 2013 refit at the Mykolaiv shipyard, the submarine's electronics were slightly improved. Basic digital interfaces were added for processing sonar data, and the control systems were somewhat updated to display information from old analog sensors on new screens. However, the core remained from the 20th century, with no modern radar technologies or active phased arrays. The communication systems remained analog, and therefore were highly vulnerable to electronic jamming. They lacked frequency hopping and encrypted digital channels, which became standard after the Cold War. These sensors were enough to deal with the threats of the 1970s, like loud propeller-driven anti-submarine aircraft. But against modern systems, they were powerless. Foxtrot-class submarines were very noisy when submerged at operational speeds, putting out anywhere from 110 to 120 decibels. Because of this, they were easily detected by low-frequency towed sonars. This visibility was easy to explain. The diesel machinery lacked proper sound insulation, and the hull-mounted hydrophones could not filter out background noise or interference in shallow water. The main weapon of the submarine Zaporizhzhia, which belonged to the Project 641 diesel-electric boats, were 6 bow 21-inch torpedo tubes. They could launch heavy torpedoes at both surface ships and other submarines. Another 4 of the same torpedo tubes were located in the stern. This allowed the crew to fight back or deliver surprise attacks from behind. The torpedoes were fired using pulses of compressed air. Immediately after that, water was flooded into the tube so the submarine would not lose its trim. Some anti-submarine torpedoes even had wire guidance. The standard combat load consisted of 22 torpedoes. This included the ones already loaded in the tubes and the spares kept on racks in the bow compartment. This was enough for several heavy salvos. The reloading process was incredibly difficult. The crew had to manually move the torpedoes from the storage racks into the torpedo tubes using overhead rails and hydraulics. When submerged, it took 10 to 15 minutes to load a single torpedo, which made quick follow-up attacks extremely challenging. The spare torpedo inventory also included decoys and training variants. These were used for drills or to confuse the enemy during a retreat. This submarine didn't have vertical launch systems for cruise missiles. It was designed in the 1960s, when such strategic capabilities weren't part of the plan. During upgrades after the 1980s, limited missile capabilities were added. These were mostly man-portable air defense systems, specifically the Strela 2M. They were used exclusively for self-defense against aircraft when the boat was surfaced. The missiles were fired manually from the deck, so they were never considered a primary weapon. When the boat was in service with the Ukrainian Navy until 2014, there were attempts to adapt newer torpedoes. However, compatibility issues arose because of the outdated fire control systems and torpedo tube mechanisms. Because of this, they had to stick with older Soviet standard munitions. The diesel-electric submarine Zaporizhzhia, which belonged to Project 641, known as the Foxtrot-class, could lay naval mines. To do this, it used its 6 21-inch torpedo tubes. Instead of torpedoes, the boat could carry up to 44 mines to blockade entire areas. This arsenal included Soviet contact mines from the MDM series, such as the MDM-1. These were designed for mining shallow waters, narrow straits, or port approaches to destroy surface ships. Soviet naval doctrine for this class placed a heavy emphasis on mine laying during exercises. This was done to simulate naval blockades or create defensive barriers. Thanks to its stealth, the submarine could secretly lay mines in contested waters like the Black Sea. Beyond mine laying, the submarine also carried out secondary missions. It conducted reconnaissance patrols to gather data on enemy shipping routes, and it could also deploy small groups of special forces. This was done through the forward escape trunk, which allowed divers to exit into the water close to shore. In theory, the boat could fight other submarines using torpedoes, since it didn't carry dedicated depth charges. This fit its main offensive purpose and allowed it to attack targets under favorable conditions. However, Its effectiveness in dynamic conflicts in the Black Sea was limited. Reloading mines or torpedoes while submerged was done manually in very cramped conditions. This process often took several hours. On top of that, the submarine had to surface or use its snorkel, which made it vulnerable to modern surveillance systems. After Ukraine received this vessel in 1997, the military command focused on defensive mine laying to protect the coastline. Because of limited resources, the submarine was much better suited for blockading territories rather than for aggressive maneuvers.